would be used.
We don't need to text it out. Okay, good morning. So yesterday we discussed the translation of the word or definition of the word nefesh in contrast with neshama. So as I mentioned yesterday, the translation we offered, I don't think is a direct translation, nowhere near that. A more direct translation is probably something like conscience, sentience, something of that nature, probably. But nonetheless, we offered this translation to use the word self, morning there. And in trying to convey what we want to convey, I think the word self works. Right? Like I was saying, nefesh habahamis, the self that is animalistic, nefesh elokis, the self that is godly, mysterious nefesh, devotion of the self, right? And expressing the self, tayas nefesh, the soul's um, what you're drawn to. What's the word?
To be drawn to something.
Yeah, yeah, the attraction and effort of the self. So the translation works in trying to convey what we're trying to convey. Because that's the way I feel me inside of me, in my body, even though I can appreciate that this self could exist independent of the body. So somebody asked, I think it was Robert asked on recording, asking how you translate the word neshama. Good, I didn't mention it yesterday. I think that's where I would use the word soul. That's where I would use the word soul when trying to translate the word neshama. Because a soul is in English, is a self, it's an ethereal word because it means something spiritual that's beyond anything that we can touch or see or feel. And that's a soul. Neshama, the way before it comes in the body. But the neshama, as it's invested within the body, becomes the self, becomes me. Right? Now, one of the reasons why I like to use this word, the self, is because it makes it less distant. Makes it less distant. When you use the word soul, or you use the word conscious, it becomes distance, and it triggers something in our minds that make us think like, okay, we don't really understand what we're talking about. But when I use the word self, well, I know what that is. I use it all the time. I talk about myself all the time. So it makes it easier to makes it more relatable. It makes it more real when I say nefesh. You have Alter says you have two nefesh, two nefashos. Yeah, you have two senses of self. One self that's completely godly, one self that's completely animalistic. That's something I can wrap my head around on a very personal, real level. That's the main objective of why I think that's a good translation, even though it's not a direct translation at all, as I mentioned. Okay. So today, what I want to do is I want to discuss the definition of the word nefesh in relation to YETZER. I mentioned this in the first class, and in context, the first chapter does speak about YETZER. It quotes sources from the Gemara which speak about YETZER. And the word YETZER, of course, is used either YETZER hara or YETZER toif, the good YETZER or the bad YETZER. And this is classically in classic Yiddishkeit, in Gemara and Musar and any other Torah works outside of Chabad Hasidus and the Kabbalah from which the Arizal from which this is drawn, the battle internally is going to be between the Yetzer Hara and the Yetzer Tov. Yeah, that's how a good Jew is taught about it when he's a young child. Now, of course, this isn't wrong. It's not wrong. The author was not coming and saying, no, it's not Yetzer Hara or Yetzer Tov, it's Nefesh Bahamas, Nefesh Elokis. It's not a good Yetzer or a bad Yetzer. It's a godly self and an animal self. That's not what the author was doing. He's saying the Yetzer doesn't exist. It certainly does. And even later in Tanya, the author discusses the Yetzer. But when the author introduces two nefashos, by saying there's two senses of self, he's getting something deeper than the struggle as it's framed using the words Yetzer Hara, Yetzer Tov. So what's a Yetzer? And then when we talk about what a Yetzer is and how that contrasts with the word nefesh, as we described it, the self, we'll see with the author introducing two nefashos, it opens up a whole new window into what our internal struggle is and what the possibilities are. Yeah, everybody with me so far? Yeah? Okay. So what does the word Yetzer mean? The word Yetzer means, inclination. That's always translated as the good inclination and the bad inclination. Now, what does an inclination mean? What's an inclination?
I would think if I were to translate it, or maybe it would more be like outcome.
Outcome of what?
Like the Yetzer means to go out.
That's with an aleph. Yud Tzadik aleph. Yetzer. This is Yetzer, Yud Tzadik Resh. Right. So Yetzer literally means an inclination. What does an inclination mean?
Inclination is, so going back to the point,
Huh.
it is inclination. It's your inclination of behavior.
Oh, so already, because we were translating the nefesh to mean self, you could see why Yetzer and nefesh are not the same thing. Because the self is inclined to do something. So the Yetzer would then be one sliver of my personality. I'm inclined to do lots and lots and lots of things.
Which one are we talking about though?
Exactly. I could be inclined to do good. I'm inclined to be bad. Yetzer tov, Yetzer hara. But it's the Yetzer, if I understand it in this way, as just an inclination. Not just, it's an inclination. That's the word Yetzer means. Then it's not the totality of me. But there's the self, and the self can have all types of inclinations, some of which are healthy, and some of which are unhealthy, some of which are good, some of which are bad, some of which are stronger, some of which are weaker. But already, just by saying that I'm dealing with a nefesh, a self, rather than a yetzer, I'm already getting to a deeper surface. You're inclined to do bad. Okay. Who is inclined to do bad? The self, the nefesh. Okay, let's talk about that, says the Alter Rebbe. So you see already? You follow what the Alter Rebbe just did here? See, now we understand the translation, you see how we're getting deeper. Just by saying that's a question of nefesh abahamis, the animalistic self, rather than the yetzer, we're going a level deeper. My animalistic self is inclined to do certain things. Are all the things the animalistic self is inclined to do bad?
No.
Not necessarily. So now but I'm going to a deeper thing, which is, okay, so if I have an inclination, I'm inclined to do things that are no good, who is the I? Who's the nefesh? Who's the self that's inclined to do these bad things? And why is he inclined to do these bad things? And how can I address it? So I'm going to a deeper level. Follow?
We wouldn't be able to survive if not for the animal soul.
Of course, exactly.
So the
self.
the inclination is not the person, right?
The inclination is not the person. The nefesh is the person. The nefesh is the person. This is the self. This is you. You say it's a tendency. So the self, because of who it is, may have some unhealthy tendencies and some unhealthy inclinations. But if I just stop at, sorry, I want to say something before I continue.
What I wanted to say is a little bit different is that how can we separate, on the one hand, yes, we can separate the action from the being. The actions don't define you. They are a part of the meaning to say that.
I'm going even deeper. I'm not just separating between the action and the self. I'm even separating between the proclivity to action and the self.
But that action has to move from somewhere. It doesn't just have to, there's no part of it.
So that becomes the question of timing. Your proclivity, your inclination doesn't come from nowhere. Where does it come from? That's the question I'm asking. Where does it come from? What are the patterns of thought that make you have such an inclination? What are the drives that make you have such an inclination? And can I do something with those? Right? In other words, like this. That's what I'm going to get to next. If the internal dispute was simply between two separate inclinations, and that's where I stopped, then what I have to do is stymie one and feed the other. So if this is a not good inclination, stop going there. That's as far as my antidote goes. But when I ask, who is the self behind the inclination, then I can ask it, where does it come from, and where'd you go wrong? Where'd you go wrong? Where did the self go wrong that it led to having such an inclination? This is why Alter Rebbe says in chapter 7 or 8 that a person can have a Jewish Yetzer, a Jewish Yetzirah, and a not Jewish Yetzirah. Right? Meaning the animal soul if it's inclined to overindulge in kosher food, hey, that's a Jewish Yetzer Hara. You understand? Yourself is about self-preservation. This is Geshmaka self-preservation. So you're inclined to enjoy it. It's not detrimental to you. So you enjoy a good steak. It's not an aberration to your existence. It's a Jewish Yetzer Hara. Okay, so maybe we have to temper it because it's too self-indulgent, etc., etc. And we have to give it new intention so that it eats that so it can serve Hashem, right? But then to take that inclination to say you want to do an Aveira, that's a non-Jewish inclination. I can only do that because we switched from dealing with my inclination to dealing with the self that produced the inclination. And once I get to the self that produced the inclination, I can say, okay, why are you inclined to do so? And if this is why you're inclined to do so, then maybe we can tweak it and make you not so inclined to do it. Or be inclined to do something else, or to do it in a healthy way. I can only do that because I'm addressing the nefesh, the self, rather than simply just addressing the yetzer, the inclination, the proclivity.
But isn't the thought,
Following?
doesn't the thought come first? Think about it, and then you're inclined to do it.
Okay, so the yes and no. I am inclined to do things even before I think. Right? Sometimes it's subconscious. But you are correct in that using the method of thought is how I'm going to switch my inclination, which is why we're called Chabad, the mind. We're using the mind to switch my inclinations, right? So already,
don't do it.
So already, by switching from Yetzer to Nefesh, my battle becomes a deeper one. Instead of the battle being listen, don't listen, or sorry, of course that's part of the battle. But instead of the battle stopping at the surface of listen, don't listen to this proclivity or to this inclination, the question becomes deeper. Where does my inclination come from? Where does the proclivities come from? Are they healthy? Are they unhealthy? Can I switch them? Can I tweak them? Because now I'm addressing the nefesh, I'm addressing the self, rather than just the proclivities that the self has.
But those
Clear?
proclivities are derived from the nefasha.
Of course they'll be derived from the self. Everything will be derived from the self. But they'll all be derived from the nefesh. So I have to go into the nefesh and say, okay, why did this nefesh land?
That's learned. Was it learned?
Yeah. Yes.
You're not-
Says
you're not
that,
born with it?
that a Jewish animal soul, a Jewish animal self, a Jewish animalistic self shouldn't have a proclivity to do sin. Proclivity to overindulge, that makes sense. But when you give in to the proclivity to indulge too much and you allow the self to be completely untamed and allow the self to have no discipline whatsoever, then it eventually will start having an inclination toward things that are completely unhealthy, like sin. And you shouldn't have had that. Your self shouldn't be wanting sin. So start reining it in. Start talking to the self and start realizing that the self has a proclivity. It's unhealthy. Start changing the thinking.
It's also a sin.
Not in the same level, obviously, which is the whole paragraph, right?
Right, but it's still
It's not complete aberration to the existence of the self, even though, right? But that's what he calls Shed Meshedin Yodain versus Shed Meshedin Yochrain. Okay, that's number one. Which gets to the following. Another translation to the word Yetzer. The word Yetzer, which we translated as inclination, in Chassidus we find the translation that the word Yetzer comes from the word Siur. You switch the letters around in Yetzer, you get Siur. Siur, Tzadik Yud Vav Resh, or Tzadik Yud Resh as opposed to Yud Tzadik Resh. Yetzer is Yud Tzadik Resh. Siur is Tzadik Yud Resh. And Siur means an image. An image. So explains Chassidus in a number of places that the Yetzer is just taking some element of you and giving it a shape, giving it an image. And the image can either be good or no good. Namely, the self, in some places in Chassidus tells this, that the self, specifically the animalistic self, is the capacity to desire. Capacity for lust, for desire. But that desire can take on a healthy tziyur, a healthy image, or an unhealthy image. Take lust in its most basic instinct. It could be completely unhealthy, desiring and taking on an image that is unhealthy, terrible, and sinful, etc. Or it could be very healthy, with one spouse, mikveh, under the right circumstances, etc., and it could be the greatest mitzvah. So depending on the tziyur, depending on the yetzer, it's either an type, it's either good or bad. That's only in its tziyur, it's only in its image, It's only in its proclivity. It's not in its root. Its root is in the nefesh, which is the self. And the self is not at the core ugly. The self at the core is just the self. It's the self that wants to survive, which is the self that wants to self-express. It's the self that wants to function. But it could take on a tziyur. It could take on an image. It could take on a proclivity. It's not good for it. That's a ra. But if I reshaped the proclivity, it could be toiv, it could be good. Following?
Thought,
Very good.
thought would be this year. Thought.
I experience my proclivities in my thoughts, but they aren't necessarily my thoughts. Meaning, thought is the place where I experience the self. So all the self stuff are going to be experienced in my thoughts, my loves, my hates, my proclivities, my ideas, etc., etc. So they aren't necessarily thoughts, but they're experienced in the thoughts, which is why the thoughts will be where I'm going to fix them. So I'm going to use my thoughts to rewire my thinking and say, okay, let's give this proclivity a new tzir. Let's give it a new image, a more healthy image. Okay.
So
Number
the
two.
karma comes first.
Yeah, always. Okay, but I don't want to go down there. Let's stay focused on the subject matter here. Okay, so that's the next thing. The difference between Yetzer versus, it's the first two things. The difference between Yetzer versus Nefesh is that Nefesh, I'm dealing with a much more fundamental and much more first principles. I'm dealing with the problem much more on a first principle basis. The root from which the Yetzer emerges and fixing it from there, rather than pushing back against this inclination is bad and just putting my ears and saying, blah, 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 you're bad, you're bad, you're bad, you're bad. Now I'm saying, no, hold on a second. Where do you come from? What's the self that produced this Yetzer? That's this image, and see if I can fix it. So I'm going on a deeper level, which the Alter does in Tanya, of course, which is why right when he tells us you have two nefashos, he starts launching into, okay, what's inside a nefesh? What makes up a self? The mind, the chachma, the bina, the das, the love, the fear. These are the things that make up the self. And then once I understand what all the tools of the self are, I can now work with it to switch my Yetzer, to switch my image of the proclivities that are less ugly, less unhealthy, and make them more healthy. Number one. Number two, if we just stop the level of Yetzer, okay, if Yetzer hara, Yetzer toiv, you have a good inclination and a bad inclination, that's where we stopped. And we didn't address the fact that you have two nefesh, you have two sense of self. Then that would mean every internal dispute between my good inclination, bad inclination, would be a living contradiction. Because the one self has a proclivity to opposite directions. And I feel like a hypocrite all the time. Because I constantly have proclivities toward opposite things. Whilst I'm engaged with one inclination, I have a proclivity towards doing Torah mitzvahs. And then all of a sudden, I start getting images in my head that are not healthy, that are sinful images.
People sometimes judge.
Oh, and now it's like now I
see them do something.
I self-judge. I self-judge my own prayer, my own davening, my own Torah as a waste of time. Because look, even when I'm engaged by Yetzer Tov, even when I'm good with my positive inclination and learning and davening, my bad inclination is pulling the other direction, which means I am a failure. Says the Alter in chapter 28, not true. Why? Because it's not just two inclinations that come from one self, and therefore the one self is living a contradiction in two inclinations. It's two selves. It's two versions of the self. One version of the self has its inclination and has its proclivity toward good, and one version of the self has its proclivity toward, or can end up with proclivities that are toward bad.
Naturally bipolar.
So we naturally have two versions of self. So it's not the fact that I have two inclinations is not a contradiction, and it's not a hypocritical state of existence. It's a competing state of existence. It's not hypocritical. If it was one me that had two inclinations, that means I would have been born as a hypocritical, contradictory existence. But now that Alter told me it's not one self with two proclivities. It's two selves that end up with two proclivities, yeah. But it begins at two self. So now it's not one self living hypocritical, contradictory existence. It's competing selves that play out in different inclinations. But at their core, it's two versions of me that are battling. Not one version of me with two inclinations that it has to choose between. It's two different versions of me I have to fight for. The fight is much deeper. It's much, much deeper. And an understanding that I'm not a living contradiction. I'm a living competition.
That means there's two selves too.
Correct. Two versions of the self. There's a self that's completely animalistic, and there's a self that's completely godly. And there's the battle. Which version of me am I embracing? Not which proclivity am I feeding,
Which is the real.
or which is the real me. We'll get to that maybe in our next part of our series. Which is the real me? Which me do I identify with? Which me do I embrace? Not a question of there's me, a living contradiction, and the question is which one of my proclivities am I going to feed? Well, I know I'm lying because I still have that other proclivity. That's how we often feel. Says the Alter, but no, it's not one self with a contradictory proclivity. It's two versions of self, and that's where the battle is. So the battle is not, am I going to do good or do bad? That's not the real battle. That would be the battle between YETZER and YETZER. Are you going to give in to your proclivity to do bad, or are you going to give in to your proclivity and your inclination to do good? That's not the real question. The real question is, which version of myself am I embracing?
So it's
It's a
like, in
much
other words,
deeper battle. I have to go deep to the root of where do these inclinations and proclivities come from? And then which one of those two versions of me am I going to, versions of self, nefesh, am I going to embrace?
It sounds like there's a third entity here. Because if
Because there is a third entity.
you're pulling back and look and making a choice, there has to be a third
Yes,
entity.
there is a third entity. And we spoke about that way back when. Remember, we spoke about the babushka, we spoke about the levels of conscience. There is a third entity, the nefesh hasichlis, which is the self that is conscious, the self that is the intellectual self, the self that is rational, the rational self, and it's the choice maker. So there is a third version of me. Very, very, very astute point you are making. That is correct. And when you learn Tanya, you have to come to the conclusion there's a third version of the self. It's choosing between the two other selves. We spoke about that once. We're not going to speak about that now, but for those who are watching the series, I would recommend going back to listen to that other.
Chapter.
We stopped and we took a little. We have a little series. We put it on our YouTube channel called the many nefashos of the time. Yeah. Okay. So this concludes our first definition of nefesh, and we're defining nefesh as the self as opposed to soul, which is like an abstraction of the soul that exists outside the body. But once that soul is in the body, it becomes a self, it becomes a nefesh. And then nefesh as opposed to the exterior proclivity, right? So we went nefesh comparing it to that which is higher, and nefesh comparing it to that which is lower. So nefesh comparing to that which is higher, self versus soul, which is higher, and nefesh self versus proclivity or inclination, which is more outward. Right? Okay, God willing, our next word is going to be hislapshos, enclosed, and we'll speak about that tomorrow in coming days to explain what that's all about, and we'll link it back to what we spoke about here as well. Okay, have a good day, everybody.
That's the